Good afternoon. I'm Jim Torrance, president of the Blue Mountain Ratepayers Association. I'd like to welcome everybody to our Town Talks member forum. As you're aware, this session is going to be focused on town fresh and wastewater systems, and there's a high level of interest in this area, partly, of course, given the demands that our rapid growth in our community will put on these systems. And also the well-publicized challenges that our neighboring town of Collingwood has had to deal with in terms of, their inability to maintain capacity to keep up with their growth, which resulted in having to put a rather controversial one-year moratorium on new building development. So, as I say, there's a lot of interest in this topic. With us today from Town Hall, we have Shawn Carey, Director of Operations, and Allison Kershaw, Manager of Water and Wastewater Systems. So thank you and welcome to Shawn and Allison. Joining me from the Ratepayers Association on our panel, Brian Hartness and Scott Finley, who are both very closely involved in monitoring infrastructure, construction, and management for the town. We'll begin the session with about a 15-20 minute presentation from Shawn and Allison. They'll be providing us with an overview of the water systems. And then following that, as Crystal mentioned, we'll move into the Q&A portion and certainly encourage our members to submit their questions. We've got a few questions of our own that we'll be posing. But we hope that, as has been the case with a couple of other infrastructure-related sessions with Shawn, that we get some good information, some good insights generated, and some good discussion as well. So with that, let me turn it over to Shawn and Allison to give the introductory presentation, and we will get on with our session.
Great, thanks, Jim, and good evening, everybody. Thanks again for inviting me to your Town Talk session. I think as we've been here before to talk about infrastructure and also our transportation as well. So one of the other hot topics and priorities for us as staff, and that we've been talking with council on, is infrastructure capacity. And tonight we wanted to focus on water, just given some of the as Jim had pointed out, there has been some discussion as that of late with our neighboring municipality and some of the things that we're undertaking to keep on with keeping our system intact. So, Crystal, did you? Oh, there we are. Thank you. So just Allison and I are going to just tag team this a bit, and just want to thank Allison for joining me tonight. Allison is immersed every day in water and wastewater, and she's a busy lady trying to deal with not only asset replacement and growth for our infrastructure on water and wastewater, but also just maintaining and operating the system with her two teams. So I want to thank Allison for taking the time tonight as well to join us and help me through this as well, because she is much more knowledgeable than I. So as Jim said, we'll try to keep, there are a lot of slides, but Allison and I talked before, we're going to try to breeze through some of them, because some of them we may be able to refer back based on some of the Q&A, and that's really the heart of tonight, is to get into the Q&A session. But we felt it would be a good idea for us all to be on a similar page with respect to understanding both our treatment facility and our distribution system, because I think that's important to get the dialogue going. And then so Allison will provide a bit of an overview on that. We'll talk a bit about the programs we have in place, some of the challenges and opportunities that we're currently facing, and just end with some highlights. And then I'll turn it back to Jim for for the Q&A portion, which we're excited to enter into. So maybe with that, Allison, I'll just flip it over to you, and she's going to take us through a few slides, and then I'll take over at the end.
Thanks, Shawn, and thanks for having us. I'm on the screen right now. You can see a map of our town. It demonstrates where our water infrastructure is located. So basically our water distribution system runs along the shoreline. We service Thornbury, but not Clarksburg, some of Clarksburg, but not Clarksburg proper, and along the shoreline to Craigleith and all of the village area down to Price's subdivision is all serviced with our town water, as well as Laura Bay at the west end. We do have a water taking agreement with the town of Collingwood, and we take it basically at the corner of T's Place is where we receive some water from the town of Collingwood. You can just go on to the next slide. This gives us a bit more description of some of our facilities out there. So the elevation in the town of Blue Mountains makes it challenging for a water system, as we have 14 different pressure zones. So we have many different ways of boosting pressure and reducing pressure. And you can see a number of different booster stations on the map, as well as reservoirs, additional storage. And that's how we manage keeping our water pressure within a reasonable range. You can go to the next slide. So for a drinking water system, there's a lot of approvals and oversight. The Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks play a big role. So they've issued us a drinking water license and a permit. We also have a permit to take water that we have to monitor how much water we take from the bay, and there's an upper limit to what we can take. And additionally, we have a drinking water quality management system of which we're accredited to maintain our quality management system. We're audited by an external auditor every other year and an internal auditor every year. The next slide. So our water plant is situated on the shores of Georgian Bay. It was originally constructed in 1978 with a rated capacity of 5,000 cubes a day, retrofitted in 1988 with 2 Trident absorption clarifiers, and it had a rated capacity of 13,000. 1991, it was re-rated to have 13,536 cubic meters a day. And then in 2009, we replaced the existing conventional filters with a Paul membrane system. And currently we have 3 Paul membrane trains running, but it has a capacity for 2 more trains. So we do have additional capacity at the plant. Yeah, you can go on to the next slide. So there's our plant. It's at the end of Peel Street at the west end of Thornbury. It's a surface water plant and the source is Georgian Bay. Our intake is roughly 600 meters off the shore directly out. It's in 8 meters of water. Really great source water. It's a rock bottom there, and it's excellent source water. Go on to the next. So that's just our treatment train, and I'm just going to go through it in a few more steps in the next couple slides, because that's kind of hard to read, but shows that there's a lot of things going on in place. So in the top picture, you can see the blue pumps sticking up. Those are our low lift pumps, and those are the pumps that bring the water into the plant. There's 3 of them, as you can see in that picture, and behind the red, they look like pumps, but they're screens. They're screening units, and that does our core screening. You can see them in the bottom picture as well. Yeah. After it's screened, it goes through the Paul membrane system. That's the 3 trains you can see in the upper picture, and in the lower picture, that's what the inside of the Paul membrane looks like. So it's like spaghetti kind of, and the water sits on the outside, like their untreated water sits on the outside, and it's like a straw, and it sucks it through the membrane. It does an excellent job of controlling pathogens, and it's really an excellent system. Next slide. So after it goes through the membrane system, it enters our clear well. It sits in the clear well to allow the chlorine that we put in at the intake. Our chlorine, we do chlorinate with chlorine gas right out to the intake. So it goes right out the 600 meters right out into the bay. And then it sits in our clear well to allow that chlorine to react and give it time to kill everything that's in the water. After it leaves the clear well, it then goes through a UV disinfection. And you can see in the lower pictures, you can see the 3 UV chambers, and then it's pumped out by the pumps that are on the bottom picture, close to the bottom. Those are our high lift pumps that pump it out into our distribution system. So that's our plant in a nutshell. Additionally, at the plant, we also have a backup power generator. It's a 400 kilowatt diesel generator. And if the power goes out, or if the power supply is just even interrupted, it starts up automatically, so we can continue to make water without even noticing. So currently our water plant can provide up to 15,140 cubic meters a day. We have an agreement in place with the town of Collingwood to take up to 1,250 cubes a day. However, we only take about 400. And we also supply Collingwood some water too. We feed back into their system. mostly down Long Point Road where they don't have any water mains. So we provide it to their residents as well. And this is basically how we see the flows, what the demand is. So you can see every month isn't the same. It really fluctuates. We do, we do see higher demand during grass watering season. So when the irrigation systems are on, that's when we usually see our peak demand, and we're getting up to around 10,000 cubes a day during our peak demands. And the blue line is our monthly average daily demand. So we can move on to the next. And this is where we sit for capacity. So right now our allocated units is the blue, and that allocated means people who are connected already, houses that are connected already, and houses that can connect, meaning that they have a water main in front of their house and they have a lateral to the water main. All they have to do is hook up. So that's how many people could be connected at any point in time. And then the next is the red chunk is the reserved units. And that means they have been given approval to build a distribution system or a development. And the third, the green 3,000 units, 3,300 is available to be connected. And those numbers are as of December 31st, 2021. So this shows our historic water demand over a number of years. The orange line at the top is the most water, is the total water that's available. Now you're probably wondering, why did it drop down around 2014, 2015? Well, we reduced our water taking from the town of Collingwood. We were taking 4,000 cubes a day, and then we dropped it down to 1250. So that's why the actual firm capacity dropped down. The blue line the blue line indicates the reserved and allocated. The light green is the allocated, and the dark green is our actual connected unit. So you can see that we do have a fair bit of capacity left in that plant. On to the next. So our distribution system, we currently have 125 kilometers of water main, 5 reservoirs, 7 booster stations and rechlorination stations, and 14 different pressure zones. And our water mains vary in size from 50 millimeters, which is 2-inch, up to 14 millimeters, which is 16-inch water mains diameter. And I'll turn it over to you, Shawn.
I think you were going to do this one, and then I was going to take it. Yeah.
So this indicates our leaks. This is our infrastructure leak index. And right now we're running about 32% water loss, which sounds really shocking, but when you consider the dynamics of our municipality, and we use a fairly complicated spreadsheet to determine our infrastructure leak index, we are in the good range. Now that considers things like the density of our properties. If we had a lot of properties in a small block, say something like the city of Toronto, we would be selling a lot more water. And therefore, even if we lost the same amount, our percentage of loss would be much lower. However, in the town of Blue Mountains, we have a lot of estate type lots and long stretches where we don't have any users. So we have a number of connections of pipe, and you can think of every connection of pipe, there is a potential for it to leak. So that it takes that into consideration, and the pressure zones that we have, we're running about 3.7 on our ILI, which is considered in the good range.
Okay, I'll take it from here. Thanks, Allison. So I'll just quickly go through some of the challenges that we deal with our water system. As Allison said earlier, we do have 14 different pressure zones, and that's partially part of our topography, the long run we have of our system along the shoreline. And part of that is trying to keep our water pressure for residents within a certain range, right? So it's not too high or not too low. And that does cause some challenges for our operators. And there is a cost to doing that as well in terms of pressure reducing valves, et cetera. We spoke about the long, narrow system with few users, and Allison had talked about that and the significant leaks. We'll talk a bit in a couple of slides here about what we're doing to address that. We do have some undersized and challenging water mains. Again, we have a program to deal with that on a capital side. The other, which has been ongoing and as of late, some discussion with council around common element condos and private water systems and private plumbing within those common element condos that in some cases loop back onto our water main, and you know, our water team does a great job of trying to manage that as it relates to the interface with our public system. Water theft is an ongoing challenge that we have both with existing users and in development as well. And so just on that, and I don't know that I have this in a future slide, so I'll speak to it now. We did get approval from council to add an additional water and wastewater bylaw officer who is has additional kind of penalties now, or will have additional access to other tools in the compliance toolbox, so to speak, to deal with water theft. And so, you know, that's a key point for us in both getting the word out about what that is and the impacts of that. And then at the far end of that kind of compliance spectrum is having stronger enforcement options to deal with that. We also have leaks on the private side as well as the public side, and we've got a program in to deal with those leaks, and how we deal with it on a private side is a challenge that we're trying to address. And then just having only one water trunk main from Thornbury to Craigleith. And this is something that we'll address a little bit later, but that's causing some operational challenges for us as well. Next slide, please. The other challenge we have is not having enough in certain areas of the distribution, not having enough storage for fire flow, and we've got a capital projects that we're focused on, and I'll talk about that in a minute about how we're addressing that. As Allison said, and as Jim alluded to in his intro remarks, is we are reliant on a certain amount of supply from the town of Collingwood and our east end. We do have some flow restrictions out of the water treatment plant. And we have a small clear well. So when we're looking at future expansion plans for our existing facility, that's something that we'll be taking into consideration. And we do have backup power, as Allison said, but it's not entirely sufficient to run the facility over a certain duration. And we're also looking at UV treatment as well, and some options around trying to address that challenge. So next slide. So here's some things we do have in place, some programs, and Allison's well versed in these, and we've shared these with council in the past when we were talking about water loss and in some cases water theft. We do have a acoustic leak detection program in place to try to sort out where we have problem areas from leaky pipes. We do have a substandard water main replacement program, and I'll speak to that in a future slide. As the ratepayers are likely aware of, we are in the midst of about to start reconstruction of the older part of Thornbury, and that's Thornbury reconstruction phase 1, and that will really help us with dealing with older infrastructure, particularly on the public and private side. And we're going to be actively repairing leaks as they become apparent. We are looking at replacement of residential water meters, and that's a capital project I'll speak to. And then we're also working with development to ensure installation of meters in a timely manner. And this has been a big push as of late to make sure that when development is under build, that we're actually metering that water to support that development early on in the process, so that there's no, I won't say freebies, but I'll say freebies, and that they're paying into the system. And we have an active preventative maintenance program for major pieces of equipment, which Allison and her team do an excellent job of ensuring that we have we're looking after our assets and our infrastructure. So as I spoke about, we have recently completed some pretty big class environmental assessments. These are really not just, but they're important studies to help us understand what our short, medium, and long-term infrastructure needs are. So we recently completed the West Side water storage class environmental assessment. That is really addressing our fire storage issue in the west end of the municipality. And so we've got capital projects lined up right now that are entering into engineering design to address that. Clarksburg Master Plan Class EA is finalized. Servicing Clarksburg has been a challenge from a cost standpoint and just technical standpoint as well. And those are two interrelated kind of obstacles, we'll say, or challenges at this point around trying to service Clarksburg in an affordable, but also in an effective and sustainable manner. Right now, a really important, it's really, I would say a really important project we have is the East Side Water Storage and Supply Class Environmental Assessment. And this is looking for options as to how we're going to get water into the east end of the municipality, and also to store it, and also for supply as well. And so we're actively going through that EA right now. We're kind of midstream in that process, and we'll probably get into a bit of that later on in the Q&A portion. I also wanted to put a plug here for a community sustainability plan. And this is another ongoing initiative that we have that I hope that the members are aware of. And because we talk about things like water loss or water usage, and water conservation comes to mind, and the need to have strong water conservation measures in place. Also to make sure that we're building climate resilient infrastructure. So that's a part of what we're looking at with the community sustainability plan. It's a foundational plan that will, I would hold up there with the official plan. Next slide, please. So I won't really touch on those that we've recently completed, but ones that we have underway is a really large project, which is a water main replacement and moving towards the use of smart meters. And I think, Allison, if I'm correct, we're looking at, however we're going to phase this out. We're not exactly sure yet, but around a replacement of about 5,000 meters. This will really help us better understand water usage. There's a whole pile of benefits with that project, and it's a big one with a lot of added benefit. I talked about Thornbury West reconstruction. That's going to really help both on the wastewater and water side of getting that old infrastructure replaced and dealing with leaks, and just a more effective and sustainable infrastructure. We also have phase 2 of our substandard water main. This is an asset replacement project. I'll speak about that in a minute. And as I said, we did finalize our West Side Water Storage and Supply, or West Side Storage EA, and we have a number of preferred alternatives that came out of that study, which we are actively looking at engineering design for that, for those items that you'll see listed on the slide. Next slide, please. So this is just a quick plug for the East Side Water Supply and Storage EA. This is kind of the area or the nodes that EA will be focused on. I'll probably leave this slide. I'll move on to the next one because I expect we'll speak to this in the Q&A. Just a couple of highlights. One of the things to look forward is we're bringing at the end of June our annual capacity report. This focuses both on water and wastewater, and this will be for 2021. So it'll show in greater detail what Allison has already talked about around, how many allocated units we have, how many remaining units do we have left within our existing capacity, both on water and wastewater. One of the things we're quite proud of is we recently received $3.46 million grant through the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program. And that's for our substandard water main project. So this is replacing aging infrastructure, which is highly needed, and will deal with leaky infrastructure. It will reduce the amount of breaks that our water team have to respond to, et cetera. The other thing that we're really proud of, and Allison and I are very proud of our water team. We recently received 100% compliance rating from the ministry. This is a high bar to make and to achieve, and I think it's really important that our residents and our ratepayers understand that the amount of diligence and effort that goes into achieving this type of compliance rating on a very stringent set of rules. And obviously for drinking water, we need to uphold that, and really proud of our team for achieving that perfect score. And then the other ongoing item that we're in active conversation with is the town of Collingwood around water supply. I think we're continuing the discussions on that. I've asked for a reduction in that water supply to deal with their own water supply issues. We're dealing with that, ongoing is all I can really say at this point, but we are looking through our east side water supply EA, as I mentioned earlier. We're looking at different options, such as a regional approach to water sharing and water supply, looking at expanding our existing facility, maybe building our own facility for long-term supply, or buying our supply from Collingwood. So, there's a number of options that we're looking at through that EA, and the EA is a great decision-making process to help us understand where the pros and cons of those, and obviously consultation with stakeholders and the public. So the other thing I did want to mention that I didn't have on the slide there is we do have a mayor's task force that we have pulled together that has a number of consulting. It's all voluntary, but it's a number of local and regional consulting firms and other expertise that are helping us with understanding various solutions and creating awareness around some of the capacity challenges that most municipalities in Southern Georgian Bay are dealing with, but obviously in this case focused on the town of Blue Mountains. And that's kind of a lesson learned from what our neighbors to the east in Collingwood were experiencing with water supply and their capacity issues. Is we want to get awareness out there that, hey, like, we're growing quickly, the rate of growth is high, and in some cases we need to get some awareness out there, and also assistance technically from the experts within our area. So just wanted to let the ratepayers are aware of that mayor's servicing task force, and that's an ongoing effort to try to help us out with some of the capacity challenges we have. So maybe with that, I'll turn it back to you, Jim.
Okay, thank you, Shawn and Allison. Scott and Brian were going to be leading the exercise of posing some questions. So I'll turn it over to them momentarily. There's a question we received from one of our members. I'll start with, does the current filtration remove microplastics? And if not, when will the filters be updated to include this ability?
So it's all dependent on the size of the microplastics, but we do remove quite a bit. We have what is considered a microfiltration plant. The membranes are microfiltration, so they do remove a good portion, but we don't see, our source water is very good. So we're not seeing heavy loads of microplastics, and we're not seeing it in our waste stream either.
Thank you. Scott and Brian, did you want to pick up the string of questioning and we'll go from there?
Jim and Scott, if I could just jump in, because we were talking about capacity, I thought that's probably a good starting spot. When I look at your projections, where we are currently in terms of peak demand and what our potential is, it looks like we're probably in the 60 to 65% of capacity currently. With everything added together. Is that in the ballpark? Does that make sense?
Yes, that's precisely where we are.
Well, based on current growth projections that we've got for the town, what percent capacity do you figure we're going to be at in about 10 years?
For the full build out, we need about 30,000 cubes a day, and our plant can produce 140. But that's for the full build out. Plus we're taking 1250 from Collingwood. So we need almost double for if we build out all of our urban area. Okay.
That's actually, not sure it's the right question, but at what point in terms of your capacity, does the replacement program become critical? In other words, you can keep going in terms that you're going to increase your capacity will go from 60, 70, 75, but at 80% or something like that, action has to take place in terms of long-term planning, because it's just the town is growing too quickly, and we're going to get into a major problem if we don't act on it immediately.
So the first step when we're looking at expanding a water treatment plant is to undertake an EA, an environmental assessment, and that's ongoing right now. The east side EA, our environmental assessment, is a municipal class environmental assessment that looks at the options for not only storage, but supply of drinking water. So that's being considered right now, and that would be the very first step of expanding your wastewater or water treatment plant, sorry. And we'll have an answer for our preferred alternatives on our future supply through this EA. And then we'll consider at what point in time do we need to pull the trigger and start the design work and figure out where we're going to put a new water treatment plant, if that's the case, or if we're going to take more water from Collingwood. We're also looking at a regional supply through this EA process. So that's where we are, or if we're going to expand our current plant, and we'll have to twin the main from Thornbury down to the Craigleith area and build additional storage in the Craigleith area.
Okay, so there, you've got options that are going to be evaluated in due course.
Yes, it's
We're
not
not
only
gonna
just cost, but social, economical, environmental. We'll be looking at a whole gamut of criteria when we go through the EA process, as well as public consultation and agency consultation.
Through that process, do you believe that will be sufficient so we can avoid the problem that Collingwood got themselves into?
Maybe I can speak to that one.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah, I think we're ahead of the curve, right? I think or ahead of it. We're from a water capacity perspective, I think there's not just the treatment plant, it's about how we get the distribution out too, right? As we talked about, we've got booster stations, we've got storage facilities. And so I would say we're in a good place because EAs are not something you want to rush through because it is a decision-making process and consultation and everything else, as Allison spoke about. So I think we're in a really good place. I think it's worked well in our favor that what Collingwood is dealing with right now has come up while we're dealing with this EA, because we're able to make choices and look at options with pros and cons about, are we going to buy it from Collingwood long-term, or is it more advantageous from a whole pile of different criteria, as Allison outlined, to just build it ourselves or enter into some form of regional approach for water sharing? And when you talk about regional approach, there's a whole pile of different governance structures that you can have in place to manage that capacity and allocation of that capacity as well. So I think we're in a good place right now. And kudos to Allison for recognizing this early on and getting this EA started so that we're in a good plan, or we have a plan in place so that we can execute that from a infrastructure in the ground standpoint. And also on that, when we looked at the west side, which we finalized as part of that, what we looked at is, phasing in and staging. Like, do we have the ability to expand upon this infrastructure? What's the life cycle cost? Because, asset management is a huge component of that when we've invested in replacement of infrastructure or new infrastructure. So those are all the factors that we dive into when we're looking at the various infrastructure options through these EAs.
Okay, good to know. That's great.
Yes,
Brian, do you
one
have
of
a
the
question?
questions I had follows on with that, and I was going to ask the likelihood of a new water plant being built in the Craigleith area, mainly because Craigleith has almost 50% of the population of the town of Blue Mountains. You did mention our cost sharing or water sharing with Collingwood, which is great in this regional idea. But the problem is when somebody has an issue such as what we see in the Ukraine and Russia, if somebody has a serious problem, all of a sudden you get cut off, and you're no longer the master of your own domain. The other issue is Allison was mentioning, and I did see a cost proposal through the town budgeting some time ago about bringing a water main all the way from the existing plant to Craigleith. That now offers you approximately a duplication of what you currently have, which is long and linear, and every time you put something in the ground, it can break. So the question again is, how likely is it to have a new water plant in Craigleith, considering the population and all these other environmental and climatic issues associated with a long pipe?
So I think the EA will help us understand that. That's the whole beauty of that process, because you look at it, or you gauge those options or measure them against the same criteria. I think some of the things that, you know, what's happening right now with Collingwood has shown us that, you know, there's pros and cons, right? We're somewhat subject to this happening in the future on a water sharing agreement or a regional approach. They're also subject to rate increases as part of that. So those are all of the kind of considerations that we'd look at. Absolutely, putting a facility or a water treatment facility in Craigleith is on the table. It's one of the options we're looking at. And right now, you know, staff are looking at different locations for that and for storage facilities in Craigleith area. So absolutely, it's on the table. And luckily we have the EA process right now to help us understand, you know, are we going to invest in Collingwood's water treatment plant expansion, and what risks come with that, or the additional, like, or there could be, depending on the expense of putting in our own water treatment plant in Craigleith and expanding also our additional expansion to our existing facility as well. So we haven't got to that decision yet, but that's, again, just coming back to, that's kind of the beauty of the EA process is it helps us understand from a decision-making matrix what's the best path forward based on the risks and the criteria and consistent weighting on how we're assessing those criteria against the options.
Okay.
By the way, what's the timetable for that EA to be completed?
I believe we're into 2023 right now. And it really depends on where I don't want to get into the details of an EA processy stuff, but if we're into looking at our own, you know, water treatment plant, then we're into a Schedule C, and it's a little bit longer. But I think we're in a good place that we have the appropriate time and buffers within that to make the right decision, because this decision will be a significant one for kind of the short, medium, and long term. Because we're looking at full build out and what would be the best option or suite of options to get us there.
And
yeah, that's really what I was driving at.
Yeah. Do we have a sense for the time frame in which we kind of have to have, you know, the process play out so we can increase capacity beyond what we currently have? I mean, Allison mentioned kind of full build out, whether it's a decade or whatever, but what would be your target year for when you'd like to see another chunk of capacity come onto the system?
Well, I think, and I'll maybe turn it to Allison, but I think right now what our big focus is on is how we're getting water into the east side. So, you know, we do have a known bottleneck in our distribution system at our Arrowhead booster station. So that's something that we're focused on. We have a consultant on board right now through the EA that's helping us kind of understand what that would entail. And that's also related to this request for reduction from the town of Collingwood in the water supply as well. So, you know, we're continuing to have active dialogue with them. It's been going well about understanding our challenges with that request for a reduction. So I think from a distribution standpoint, that's more of our challenge right now than capacity. As an Allison, you might disagree with that, but I think that's, from my perspective, I think that's kind of where we're at right now from a priority standpoint.
Also, when you're considering water, it's not just drinking water that's available for your in your house use. We have to also consider firefighting. And the town of Blue Mountains has a very high standard when it comes to firefighting. We have been trying to meet the firefighters underwriter survey standard for firefighting flows. That's higher than the OBC, Ontario Building Code, and the MECP, Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks level. It's a higher standard. So when we're doing all this analysis to figure out where are we for water, we also consider what's needed for firefighting. And it's like your biggest structure on fire for so many hours, and can we meet that flow? And this is where we're running into some challenges where we need to have additional storage. When we calculate our current capacity of the wastewater, of the water system, we're looking at the max day, the one day in the entire year that we use a lot of water. And that's how we do all our calculations going backwards, is based on our max day flow. So we have quite a bit of storage in our system. We have tower in Thornbury. We have a reservoir in Thornbury, reservoir in Camperdown, one on Happy Valley and one at Swiss Meadows. So we do have a fair bit of capacity, that storage. So even if we did hit our max day, the next day won't be as higher. And we still have storage. We have about 2.5 days of storage within our system right now currently, and we are looking at adding more.
So a question for the environmental assessments that I think have already been done. We have neighbors to the west of us who may need water as we do the Thornbury, or I think it's the west side, the water tower, the increase to Lower Bay. Can it hop across Lower Bay and feed the east side of Meaford, cost sharing and all that? And the other one, of course, is Clarksburg, has been ongoing, and it is mentioned by you. So have the environmental assessments included sharing water or well, with Meaford to begin with, and then suitably, what would the word be, supplying Clarksburg if it was to go ahead?
We just recently, sorry, maybe 2019, 2020, we finished a municipal class EA for servicing Clarksburg, and that was servicing with water and sewer. And the preferred alternative was communal water and sewer. However, the cost that was associated with it was about roughly $140,000 a resident. So it exceeded our affordability criteria significantly by about $100,000. So it wasn't really deemed affordable. We are at the point where we could slide quite quickly into the final design if funding became available. So we do keep an eye out for what federal and provincial funding is available. And if there's some that comes available that would suit the needs of servicing Clarksburg, that's a priority to us, because there are some wells in that area that are not very well, like they're low yielding wells, so very limited water supply. And there's some wells with poor water quality, and the same with some of their septic systems in the area, that there are some challenges there. During the EA for the West Side EA, we did have consultation with Meaford and asked about water sharing. From my background, I'm aware of the situation with the Meaford water supply, and they are running about 23 or 25% capacity. They're not using all of their treatment train right now, so they have a lot of added capacity that they can use of their own water. However, we have had some discussions with the new Park Bridge proposal that's on the Meaford side of the line, and we're open to discussions and water sharing agreements. Should that be the case, that if Meaford can't get the water to that development site, we're willing to take it on.
Yeah. Do you have a sense for how much Meaford would need to spend on the pipes to get the water? I guess their system currently ends at that mall with the independent grocer, food store, et cetera. And how much piping would be required to get it to that new development?
I believe it's about 8 kilometers. I did the math at one point in time in order to keep the water fresh, because it's such a long haul. If there weren't many users, they'd be wasting a lot of water just to freshen it up. So we do that within our town. I'm sure you've seen the operators out flushing hydrants. So they'll be at a hydrant and we see water coming out. They are taking the chlorine out. We're not sending chlorine into the natural environment, but that's to keep your water fresh. And that length of pipe and the size of pipe that's needed for that Park Bridge development is fairly significant. So it will be a challenge for Meaford moving ahead. Right now, Park Bridge is undertaking their own EA for servicing of that site.
Yeah, and we did, just to add to that, I think Allison did say, we did have a number of meetings with both Meaford and the developer through that EA we were undertaking. There wasn't a lot of, I wouldn't say there wasn't a lot of interest, but we needed to move forward. So part of when we look at, as I said earlier, like the ability to expand and stage and phase in additional expansion to that infrastructure, we look at that. And we also did incorporate in that big EA, the West Side EA, we did incorporate Clarksburg into that as well, when the consultants do their modeling and everything, we had Clarksburg included just because, our intent is to service it with water and sewer. But in this case with the EA, we were looking at it for Clarksburg and calculating that as well for water supply and storage. And the other, I think there are some pretty big planning steps that have to be undertaken for that Meaford development. So it's not, I'm not sure exactly where it's at right now. We're continuing to have discussions with them, but I know they do have some challenges with planning proposals on that one.
Okay. Like you said, we have one question related to Clarksburg, just as to whether or not the water pressure is an issue for homes in Clarksburg that receive Thornbury fresh water. Is that an area of concern at all, or?
Not that I'm aware of. So we do have a few water services just on the north end of Clarksburg. But I believe the pressure is okay. If there's any concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out and we can go monitor your pressure. It could be something pinched like in your service line, or please let us know if anybody is having an issue.
It looks like recently we've had some projects that have had some exceedingly high cost overruns, estimates that have been made 2-3 years ago, and all of a sudden time has changed dramatically since then. And we see every day how costs are escalating around us right now. In that kind of an environment, what safeguards can you build in place to be able to keep your estimates up to date and contained in terms of the project and the final project costs? And what percent contingency do you build in as a rule?
So maybe I'll take a first step at that. I think, as we talk about some of these bigger infrastructure projects, in some cases we have to go through an environmental assessment, right? So when we're budgeting, and we've had some good discussion with Jim and Brian when we've met on this about trying to convey some of the complexities of budgeting in the way that we sometimes have in the past around what we're going to build at the end of the day, but we still have to go through an EA that's going to have to tell us what we're going to build. So estimating on that side, it takes 2 to 3 years in some cases to get from an EA through our budget cycle and then into engineering design and then finally construction. And where we've really been, and I know we've had some discussions with Collingwood and other neighboring municipalities where they're faced with similar struggles around estimating, not necessarily engineering, but the construction related costs has been a big challenge. I think one of the things that we struggled with, particularly in, I would say 2019 and 20, where we were doing initial budgeting at that time, is we hadn't had a lot of construction projects, like big construction projects, where we were able to kind of update our benchmark costs, which we use for scoping projects and for setting our budget estimates. So we were using some older benchmark costs, and then we got COVID. COVID happened, and things just, as we all know, kind of spiraled, and predictability was really difficult in the construction industry and material supplies, and continues to be. So I think we got caught in that, and it's still difficult to predict in some cases, but we are, we've gone through some big projects right now. We've got some construction projects under our belt from last year in particular. And so we have good data to work from, and use that for getting better estimates, versus like 2018 estimates of what the actual cost is from a construction standpoint. I do want to say that we have been looking at doing pre-purchasing of equipment, because that's another unknown for us. Is we can do all the planning we want, but if we can't get certain pumps, we can't get certain materials or equipment in time, then we're into delays. So we're doing where we can, doing some pre-purchasing of equipment where we know we're into like a couple of years of construction, where we have that equipment in hand, or at least we're trying to minimize the lead time in getting it. And we're also, I think we're going to realize some savings by purchasing it ourselves and reducing the middleman from the equation. So the other thing that happened too, the province also came up with new rules and regulations under the Environmental Protection Act for management of excess soils. And that's been an added cost to us that was, and all, I think both the private side and public side are trying to grapple with how to deal with excess soil, because there's quite stringent rules now. So when we're excavating for, water main or a wastewater treatment plant expansion, you can imagine the amount of fill that you need to deal with. And so we're looking at opportunities and ways in which we can reduce where we wear the risk of that and try to find sites and reduce the risk for the contractor, because when we put that risk on the contractor, the cost goes up. Yeah. So we're looking at ways in which, we're looking at aggregate sites, aggregate pits, working with them to try to locate disposal sites that are close to our municipality or within our municipality, and reduce that cost and reduce the risk.
May I make a comment for our listeners that one of the best financial functions that this town does do is it has very nice reserves on our major infrastructure issues. So Shawn was mentioning buying pipes and pumps and so on. Our reserves are in a well-positioned place where they can go and buy ahead of time and not impact the rates that the residents are currently paying. So just because somebody says we're going to buy things ahead of time doesn't mean you're going to pay more immediately to buy those items that are needed in the future. So I just want to make sure that our residents understand that the financial position of our town is we're in the top 5 or 10% of all the municipalities, and I think there are 400 of them in Ontario. So rest assured, we're in a good shape.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, and thanks for that, Brian. That's a great add-on. I think, as Allison has said, we're constantly looking for grant opportunities, and it takes a lot of effort to apply for them. But we have been seeing success in not all, but it does take time for us to do that. But when we have good plans, good studies in place, it allows, like as Allison said with Clarksburg servicing, it allows us to quickly apply to those, because usually when you're unsuccessful is when you're taking a long shot and you don't have a lot of good documentation or data to support it. And that's usually where it doesn't prove fruitful. But I feel like we've got a good handle on where things are at, and we've had some good success. I think we've had, with our, we're reducing our drawdown on the reserve on water main in particular through that 3 million and plus that we got from for substandard. So that has a direct positive impact on our reserves because we're not doing as much draw.
Shawn, is it most of that money come from the provincial or federal level?
Great point. It's usually these big infrastructure are a mix of both. It could vary between 60-40, 50-50. This one in particular was from both province and the federal government.
Yeah, I asked just, with the provincial election coming up, we've been reaching out to the candidates. We interviewed the candidates and are trying to help seed some of the thinking in terms of some of the support we need for the kind of growth that certainly we're experiencing. So yeah, I mean, if the provincial government's going to continue to provide infrastructure spending, hopefully whoever our new rep is going to be at the provincial level can sort of support our cause.
Yeah, just on that too, if I could just add to that, you may have seen in a recent council resolution, it's about half a dozen AMO delegations that council's putting forward. So Ministry of Infrastructure is one of them, MTO being the other. But that's really around transportation infrastructure, and also with the Ministry of Infrastructure is speaking to exactly what you talked about. Is we're you've heard this before, the second fastest growing community in Canada, and that's with growth, that's with tourism, and we need some assistance to keep up. And so that's council has put that forward to request that delegation with Ministry of Infrastructure for that specific purpose.
Good. We had a couple other questions came in from members. One is, I think Allison, you mentioned the term full build out, and the question is, so how is full build out defined and determined? You know, what kind of assumptions are baked into it, or is it a fairly kind of high level attempt to figure out what, you know, where the population could go at some point in the future?
So we have an area of land that's defined as our urban center, our urban area. And within there are lots that are designated for development. And the town has a density calculation for the area of land and how many homes or townhouses. And we use that to determine how many homes can be built, or condos, or whatever the build out is. And that's basically how we do it. And those numbers are refined through our official plan update, and every year our planning, we work on the capacity of our water and wastewater systems hand in hand with our planning department, looking at who's connected, who's not connected, what's coming online, what's allocated, what's reserved. So that's a yearly deep dive we take. And in the last year in particular, our planning department did an excellent job of really cleaning up some of our connected data. And we saw a little bit of a shift in our numbers because they did a lot of walkthroughs and use Google Earth to fully understand who is connected and who isn't. And also you got to consider that when we look at allocations for water and wastewater, not an apple isn't an apple. Not all connections are equal. So something like a restaurant, we consider, I believe it's 12 seating areas to equal one equivalent unit, or a hotel room, excuse me. So 2 hotel rooms would equal one equivalent residential units. So we have some math there that we use. Georgian Peak Ski Club, we consider that to be 75 equivalent units. So there's a bit of some estimation going on, but for the most part, I think we have a really good handle on who's connected, who's not connected, and what can come online.
Yeah, so it sounds like order of magnitude estimates to make sure you're not kind of caught unawares going forward with demand issues. Yeah, okay. One other question we received: how will the drainage study information be used to help the town make water, wastewater decisions that will preserve the natural watershed functions in the town and improve the function to manage seasonal and intermittent flooding?
So yeah, if we're talking about the general topic of water, yeah, I think so the drainage master plan will help in maybe an indirect way on maybe on sewage and or wastewater in particular, where how are we properly conveying stormwater? And part of that is around inflow and infiltration, particularly the interface of wastewater and drainage as well. So it's, I think the idea behind the drainage master plan is 2 things. It's how are we properly, where are deficient existing stormwater facilities, and what do we need to do to address that? And then the second part of it will be, how are we, I think we have some good recommendations that are going to come out of that plan that'll look at how are we addressing new development from a watershed perspective. So it's not just what's coming off the development, it's what's happening downstream and what's the capacity to address that, not just the bay, but how does it get to the bay as an example. I think the other key thing that we're looking at through all of these EAs and studies, and the drainage master plan is an environmental assessment as well, is making sure that we're building infrastructure that's climate resilient. So when we're looking at drainage and stormwater, how are we managing that, and how are we building infrastructure that is able to deal with what we think is coming or we know is coming from a climate perspective. So in some cases, it's not going with the typical way in which you would measure a storm event or how you would model a storm event. So we're looking at various options there. So I'm not sure if that addresses that question or not, but I fully expect what's going to come out of the drainage master plan is going to be a lot of work. There's a lot of drainage deficiencies we have. We have I would say just with our topography, not just as Allison said, with our water distribution system and our wastewater distribution system, but from drainage particularly, because we got the escarpment, we've got topography, we've got some high density development in certain areas. And how are we getting the water to the bay, right? And how are we preserving the environment in doing so? So it's a really unique project. I put it up there with the transportation master plan and the amount of effort we're putting into it and modeling. It's pretty neat stuff. So for any of the members out there that haven't got themselves engaged, you can find the project website, and there's active consultation happening on that project in particular.
I thought I'd throw one other question, of course, dealing with the east end of town. And I don't know where the Castle Glen proposal stands currently. But as I understand, it's a fairly significant proposal, and would an east end water, sort of holding system, whatever, be required to address the requirements of a development in that location?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And there's one of the slides, we don't need to go back to it, but one of the slides that we had up of the visual of the east side EA study area, it does include Castle Glen. And on that, there is an EA ongoing by the developer there. It's a private-led environmental assessment to deal with what their water supply situation is going to be. And so they did do an environmental assessment, but they're only good for 10 years. So that has expired. And now they've gone back to look at an update to that EA to look at, is the regulatory environment the same? Is the planning context the same? Is their assumptions and their recommended alternative from 10 plus years ago still valid? So we've had some good discussions with their consultant and with the owners of Castle Glen or the development group, and to make sure that we're sequencing our EA along with what they're doing so that we're not in misstep, because whatever we do with ours in terms of preferred options or looking at options, it needs to go in step with what they're thinking their water supply needs are going to be. So it's helpful that they're happening at the same time. So yeah, that's how we're addressing that from a water standpoint.
Yeah. So we've been talking freshwater to this point, right? On the wastewater side of things, could you just kind of give us an understanding of the key issues and initiatives you have in that area?
Sure. I didn't have that on my slides, Jim, but we're happy to talk about that. No, and I think when we're talking about capacity, that's a bigger issue for us. As we've talked about, we shared probably a year ago with council, is that based on the rate of growth in Thornbury collection area in particular, we've hit that 80%. We've done the EA, we've got our approval from the ministry, and we're into the design. We're past the 60% design stage of getting the wastewater treatment plant expansion built. It's coming at a cost, though. It's part of our challenges, and Scott had raised this earlier, is we did a study back in 2009 that said here's the cost of building it, and we haven't sat on it, but we kind of have, to be honest, because the rate of growth wasn't where it is today. So, we did bring that back in 2017 to update the EA, et cetera, but we were basing our budget estimate on a 2009 number and just, using like CPI to basically bring it to today. But, we raised this with council or committee of the whole anyways, a couple of weeks ago, and we're at a revised budget now of 22.5 million, where the initial budget was at 18 million, and that's for a portion of the expansion. So that's maybe one of our number one priority, is getting that capacity in place, because we're against the wall with Thornbury, to put it bluntly. So there's two things we're looking at there, is getting the capacity in place, and our timeline on that is Q4 of 2024. and part of doing that as well is, as I said earlier, like a big part of achieving that time frame is pre-purchasing equipment. We're in the process of getting that done now that we've got 60% design behind us. Because once you're at that stage, you've set your path forward. So we didn't want to get into pre-purchasing prior to that. And that's trying to set ourselves up for that 2024 timeline. The other thing that we've got is, as we've mentioned before, I think when we had our broader infrastructure discussion at a previous town talk, was around dealing with inflow and infiltration. So we're bringing a strategy forward to council in June around, it's going to be a high level strategy about how we kind of work together, both on the public side and the private side, to deal with inflow and infiltration, or I&I, because it does take up a significant amount of capacity in the plant. It's something that will never go away. We always are going to have leaky pipes, but there's more we can do to improve how we're addressing I&I. A big part of I&I will be, again, Thornbury West reconstruction. So we go into reconstruct the older part of Thornbury. That'll have a significant positive impact on the amount of I&I that's chewing up our capacity at the plant today. So all of these things are happening. And then the other side of that is we're into, I'll call it, active discussion with council about the need for not just the end facility and capacity, but how do we get it? How do we convey wastewater to the plant, which is, we have 2 pumping stations, one in which is in the Craigleith system, the other being in the Thornbury system. It's a major pumping station. And for us, this capacity is one thing, but we got to get it there. And so we're looking at things like community campus of care, which could be 600 to 700 units. We've got build out of Laura Bay and other development in the Thornbury area. We need to be able to get the wastewater there. And just to add to that, and those aren't small ticket items. They're a big purchase or a big engineering feat. I should say feat, but it takes a lot. There's a lot of detail in it. The other thing that, our existing staff have done a really good job on I would say, due diligence and dealing with assumptions that, have kind of been carried forward in the past, is we're into a new outfall, which is a very significant project. We were initially thinking, the thought based on studies done to date is that until we were at phase 3, which would be the ultimate build out, ultimate expansion of the Thornbury wastewater treatment plant, that at that time we would need a new outfall into Georgian Bay. Right now it discharge or outfalls into Beaver River. And we found out that there's a problem with that outfall that actually shrinks in size partway along the train or the piping to the actual outfall. So we have a constraint there, and we talked with council about that at Committee of the Whole on May 3rd, and that's a significant budget item. I'm glad that our staff found it, because otherwise, if we just went with the assumptions that have been made in the past, we would be into a problem, because we wouldn't be able to put out the amount of treated effluent that theoretically we should be able to with our phase 1A expansion, which is the one that is at 60% design. So that's a big ticket item, because you could imagine the studies that have to be undertaken to put a new wastewater discharge into Georgian Bay. So unfortunately, we don't want to be dealing with that because we've got enough on our plate, but I'm really appreciative that staff did the deep dive and didn't just run with assumptions that have been made in the past, and they found this now, and that we're dealing with it. So it's, Jim, to answer your question, the priority right now is Thornbury wastewater collection. How are we getting wastewater to the facility and having capacity to get it there, treating it, and then having at the end of the system being able to get it out. So yeah, that was a big surprise to us. And it hasn't got approved yet. It's going to council next week on the 24th, but we had a specific special committee of the whole to address some of our wastewater treatment issues and capacity issues that we have to focus that discussion with council, because it was a big day and a lot of big asks. So Yeah, that's from my perspective, that's really the big priority right now.
Yeah. And did you say that Q4 2024 is when you're hoping to have the expansion operable?
Yeah, that's our plan to date. Yeah, is Q4 2024.
Yeah. And I take it that's a rather critical deadline to hit, it sounds like.
It is. And I think because the other side of that is, we've got some priorities that we need to focus, like campus of care and existing approved development. And so we need to be able to have the capacity infrastructure in place to deal with that. And 2024 is, for us, is critical.
No.
So in now for Shawn, in Allison's world, we talked about the current water plant, and we talked about a possible plant through the EA that might be in Clarksburg. Is there a requirement to have a second plant, or is this plant that we currently have, we know where it's located, is it a massive expansion that it can go under, like twice its size, 3 times its size, or do you have to find a new location?
So sorry, Brian, are you talking about the existing water treatment plant?
The water treatment plant.
Yeah, so I know Allison can speak to that, but we have the ability to do some expansion there. There's some other items that will need to come along with that expansion at that site, but it won't. I'll let Allison speak to this, but it will not deal with our full build out.
So we have the potential to put 2 more trains in there. I believe that takes us up to about 23,000 cubes a day, but we have a limitation with our clear well, and that's the big basin that we rely on to hold the water for a sufficient length of time so that chlorine can do its work. When you add chlorine to water, it takes a bit of time. You need the retention time for it to be fully effective to kill all the pathogens. So that will need to be addressed. Right now, currently, our clear well is not baffled. If we can baffle it and make the water do a circuit through it, we can reduce the time that it has to sit in there, as opposed to just one great big basin and it can short circuit. However, even if it's baffled, we'll still need a bigger clear well. So that's kind of challenging in the site that we're in, being that it's right down on the shoreline. And that's a tank that sits below grade. So it is secure, but we'll have to figure out how to make that bigger. And we'll have to think about, if we enlarge that plant, about bigger high lift pumps and bigger intake pumps, low lifts. And
Allison, I'm sorry, I don't think I presented the question properly. I was talking about wastewater, our wastewater plant, and its current location, whether that can be expanded to, I'll call it twice the size it is today, or do we in the town of Blue Mountains have to find another location to take us to year 10 from here, 15 from here, and this massive expansion we're under?
So right now, you got to consider our wastewater, all our pipes go to one location. We have a fair bit of land at the Thornbury wastewater treatment plant and our Craigleith wastewater treatment plant. We have two wastewater treatment plants. One's on the end of Long Point Road, getting down towards the bay, and the other on the southern end of Gray Street. That's our Thornbury wastewater treatment plant. With our Thornbury wastewater treatment plant, it was originally a lagoon system that was built in the 1970s. In the early 1990s, they built a mechanical plant and kept the lagoon system there. And there is enough land that right next door, actually it's on the same piece of property, is our Thornbury water reservoir. So for our water system, so there's some land there that we can build on to for the wastewater treatment plant. And eventually we have mapped it out up to phase 3 expansion that will adequately service our entire build out and probably our secondary plan at the Thornbury wastewater treatment plant, but we will end up losing one of our lagoons. So right now we use our lagoons for biosolids storage. Eventually we may be looking at something like an anaerobic digester, something similar to Collingwood, where the biosolids go to an anaerobic digester with a flame off the top that can, or we can capture the methane and look at some kind of energy conversion there. that's like phase 3. That's way down the road. We have lots of room right now for expansion, and we're in good shape for land. We just need to giddy up and get going.
The point of all of this is to make sure that the people listening, their anxiety level, if they have any, will be lowered, and we know that we're in good hands, which is obviously what the output of all of what we're talking about. We're assured that we're not going to be in the news, let's put it in a derogatory manner. So welcome, thank you to both of you, and certainly to you, Allison, directly, because you won an award last year for the best drinking water, and now you got 100% from the ministry, and good for you and your team.
Thank you. Thank you. I have to say, we have excellent water and wastewater teams. I couldn't ask for a better group of people to work with.
Good.
I had a couple minor little questions left. One is, do we put fluoride in the drinking water? So is that far less common now than it would have been 10 years ago to have it?
Yes, it's a very political debate, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Windsor still fluorinate water. It's messy. It's questionable if it's effective. At one time, Owen Sound were fluorinating. It's a dangerous chemical to work with. I've done a lot of inspections of drinking water systems and wastewater systems over the years. I used to work for MOE, and I was also a lab accreditor. I went to a drinking water plant in Buffalo Pond, and that served Moose Jaw and Regina. And they had 2 headers there. It's right in the middle of Moose Jaw and Regina, and they had 2 headers there. One fluorinated and one didn't. I believe the fluorinated water went to Moose Jaw and Regina didn't. And the header, the self that's coming out of the plant, was just encrusted with from the fluorination process. So I'm glad we don't, but
yeah, no, it's interesting because it's just something that I used to hear about all the time, and it seemed like the whole world put fluoride in the water. And then I thought I had heard that it was becoming, obviously it's become less common and less supported. The only other question I have is, you talked about a fair bit of water gets stolen. So how does the water go about being stolen, if you can share that without giving away state secrets?
well, some of it's accidental, and some of it's just adding on to some plumbing, and you bypass your meter for an addition. We're putting new meters in the houses, and that's one of the things we're going to be looking for is bypasses. Some of it's intentional. Sometimes you're building auxiliary building and you choose to put that behind the meter on the wrong side of the meter. We also have, when a new home's built, they have 60 days from when the water is first connected to get a water meter installed. That doesn't always get done, especially at the rate of growth that we're seeing right now. Yeah. So sometimes houses are assumed without water meters installed. The building sites alone, it was crazy during COVID. There is a requirement to have hand washing stations. So the tails that were sticking up when they built a subdivision, the water and sewer usually go in first long before paving, because they have to do the pressure testing and make sure it's okay before they pave over top of it. Water and sewer sits underneath the asphalt. So they'd have these tails coming up, and they would just go and connect their wash basin sink to a water tail, and then turn the curb stop on themselves, and away they go. There's no meter, no security, no backflow. Puts our whole drinking water system at risk. So we were out there pursuing these during COVID, and it was like they get one shut down, another one would pop up. And then they were kind of hiding them under some equipment. We found them all over the place, and water access too, for irrigation when they're doing the new subdivisions. Right. We have charged a company with taking water from a hydrant. So that just accessing the hydrant. In the town of Blue Mountains, only water operators and firefighters have the right to access a hydrant. Nobody else. Private contractor was on there just helping himself.
and Shawn, did you mention that there's another bylaw officer on board to deal with those issues?
Yeah. So It's both with water and wastewater. So it's also to deal with, illegal wastewater connections as well, because that's adding to our I&I issue, right? And premature capacity expansions and stuff. So like that's all part of it. The other thing I'd mentioned too is that we're looking at there's a new tool we have in the Municipal Act called administrative penalties. And so to take someone who's stolen water, let's say, and to go through the Provincial Offences Act is a long process, and it chews up a lot of staff time. It's the right thing to do. But under the administrative monetary penalty process, we're able to issue essentially an administrative monetary penalty to someone that's found in non-compliance. And then that money that would come out of that goes directly back into the reserve, whether it's wastewater or water. And so we're in the process right now and so it gets rid of this whole lengthy process. The fines happen, day after day if they're continuing to commit and be non-compliant. So it's a great tool, and it goes right back. It doesn't go into the provincial coffer. It comes back to our reserves, which it should. So we're going to be updating our bylaws to give that bylaw officer the ability to issue those administrative monetary penalties to deal with water loss in particular and wastewater illegal connections.
Okay, thanks. Allison, I know you've got to head out pretty much now to head to it. Scott or Brian, any last questions before we wrap up? Okay.
No, I think it's been a discussion.
Great. So Shawn and Allison, thank you for joining us for your first session with the Ratepayers Virtual Forum. But it's actually fascinating to hear about the science that goes into all of this, as well as the issues around construction, financial management, operation, etc. So I think it's been a really good overview of some of the key issues. We know the growth we're experiencing is going to add pressure to all of the infrastructure that we're dealing with, but in a lot of regards, none are more important than water and wastewater, obviously. So we will continue to track progress being made. And one thing that we've been working with Shawn on is to try to develop a key project tracker that we can institute and then update probably a couple times a year. So I think we're getting closer to the point of being able to actually kind of finalize that kind of a tracking report that, as I say, we'll share with our members through the sort of the course of getting the key projects up and going. So, but again, thank you both for your time. Much appreciated.
Thank you guys.
Thank
Great
you all.
session.